The 3,000-page hearings of the congressional investigation of the Reese Committee, investigation of the subversive activities of the tax-exempt foundations. I bought the only available copy in the country, 3,000 pages, from a really good friend of mine, a wonderful American. He had been offered any amount of money for that 20 years ago by one of the minions of the tax-exempt foundations. They did not want that copy to be floating around. The research director for those hearings, his name was Norman Dodd. I knew him. And the conversation that I'm going to discuss right now that he had with the president of the Ford Foundation, Rowan Gaither, was off the record in New York City at Ford Foundation headquarters. And Norman Dodd told me over dinner in Washington, D.C., in a restaurant in Georgetown, Rowan Gaither said to him, Mr. Dodd, you know, basically, we at the foundations, we don't determine the agenda. The agenda has come from directions from the White House. That was Eisenhower at the time, right at the peak of the Cold War. And that agenda, our instructions are to use our tax-exempt status, your money, folks, change America so it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union.
Now, have you personally had contact with some of the directors of these great foundations?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell us about it?
Well, one instance, I'll use a couple of instances as illustrations. One instance had to do with my responding to an invitation from the president of the Ford Foundation, who asked me if, when I was next in New York, would I stop in their office and have a visit, which I did. And on arrival, after amenities, Mr. Gaither, who was the then president, said, Mr. Dodd, we invited you to come and see us this morning, hoping that you would, off the record, tell us why the Congress was interested in operations of foundations such as ours. And before I could think of how I would reply to him, he volunteered the following. He said, Mr. Dodd, those of us here at the policy-making level have all had experience either with the OSS or the European Economic Administration in operating under directives, the origin of which was the White House. We today operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is? And I said, yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he said to me, the substance of the directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, figuratively, I nearly fell off the chair. But I did remark to him, Mr. Gaither, in the light of what you just told me, many of your grants make sense. I can understand them. But I do not think you're entitled to withhold this information from the people of this country to whom you are beholden for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell them what you've told me? And his answer was, Mr. Dodd, we wouldn't think of doing that. So I said, well, Mr. Gaither, answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you've just told me.
And so they've been pushing socialism in America ever since.
Well, then, in the light of that, of course, you see conditions develop, and of course you then can add and ascribe the development of these conditions and the events that accompany to this policy, because it's only in the light of that policy that these events and effects make any sense.
Now, a lot of you may say, well, that never happened. Well, it's happening right now, folks. It's happening right now as we speak. Foundation-funded non-bloody revolution. Committee Chairman Carol Reese warned fellow congressmen of a diabolical conspiracy that a certain few foundations were financing the socialist and communist overthrow of the United States. After World War I, they tried to get the League of Nations in. And there was tremendous opposition to that. And then you had opposition between then and between World War II. You had Lindbergh and a lot of Americans going before the Congress to keep us from going into the UN. You had all sorts of opposition. But they got their way. The Reese Committee learned that the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace were, with tax-exempt dollars, funding leftist propaganda operations aimed at changing America through the brain, not the battlefield. Patriotism, national sovereignty, individual responsibility, and Christian beliefs were belittled, while the concepts of a one-world government, socialism, collectivism, and humanism were deemed essential for peace in the modern age. A clandestine and successful non-bloody revolution had been masterminded by some of America's most powerful and devious men who did not want to be exposed by a congressional investigating committee. The man chosen by Reese to be the committee's research director was Norman Dodd, Yale graduate, intellectual, and New York investment banker. During this writer's frequent visits to Dodd's retirement home in Keene, Virginia, he repeatedly spoke, Dodd, of his conviction that justice demanded that those foundations should be compelled to spend a like amount of dollars to undo the damage they have done to America, end quote. Dodd sent committee questionnaires to numerous foundations, and as a result of one such request, Joseph E. Johnson, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, invited Dodd to send a committee staffer to Carnegie's headquarters in New York City to examine the minutes of the meetings of the endowment's trustees. Now, this is Carnegie we're talking about, the one I always go after. These minutes had long since been stored away in a warehouse, and obviously Johnson, who was a close friend of former Carnegie president and Soviet spy Alger Hiss, had no idea what was in them. Don't forget, Alger Hiss headed up the UN in San Francisco. He was the head of the whole thing, world government. The minutes reveal that in 1910, the Carnegie trustees asked themselves this question, quote, is there any way known to man more effective than war to so alter the life of an entire people, end quote. This is in the minutes. For a year, the trustees sought an effective, peaceful method to alter the life of an entire people. But ultimately, they concluded that war was the most effective way to change people. Oh.